Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Okay, welcome back to all my friends and listeners out there. You got Jim here. Today we're going to continue in the study of the history of Christianity. And before I get started, I just wanted to thank all the people who had nice things to say about my answering the question from the African pastor who wanted to know why there seemed to be discrepancies between the genealogies in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke. So the pastor who asked the question was thrilled with the answer. He could not wait to get back to his congregation to explain this to them. So this is the kind of satisfaction that I get from doing this Bible teaching at the Bible Exposition channel. So as you remember, the last time we got into this study, we were introducing a man by the name of Polycarp. Polycarp was the bishop in Smyrna, and he wanted to know, he's writing a letter to the Christians in Philippi, and he's asking if they have any news regarding Ignatius. Now, if you remember, the answer from the Philippians never got through. It seemed that Ignatius died as he expected his arrival shortly in Rome. So, nothing is really known about how exactly Ignatius was killed, if he was killed, if he died from natural causes. There's much more information regarding one of his disciples, a guy named Polycarp. And this is the year now 155 AD, and the policy that Trajan had outlined for Pliny were still in effect. Christians were not to be sought out, but if they were accused of something and they refused to worship the Roman gods, small g, they were to be punished. And we know of the events in Smyrna through a writer who claims to have witnessed them. And what happened was a group of Christians were brought before the authorities there, and every single one of them refused not only to worship their God, but to recant this so-called Christianity. And they did this under the knowledge, or with the knowledge, that if they didn't worship the God and they didn't recant Christianity, they're going to be tortured. So this guy writes that he's resting in Christ and he scorns the pains of the world. Now also there's a guy who's being tried there named Germanicus. He's a very elderly individual, a devout Christian, and he's on trial, and he was told that, or the tribunal was told that maybe they should take into account his old age. And this is what his response was, this guy Germanicus. He said he had no desire to continue living in a world where injustices, as he was witnessing, were taking place. And to show how deeply he meant his words, he called for the Roman beasts, the dogs and the lions, to come and kill him. And this just enraged the Roman mob, who began to shout, "Death to the atheists." Now, the Romans believed that these Christians were atheists because they worshipped a God that could not be seen. So the proconsul who was presiding at the trial tried to persuade him, urging him, Germanicus, to think about his advanced age and worship the emperor. How hard is that? So he refused, and then Polycarp also refused, and the judges said, out with the atheist. And Polycarp responded by pointing to the crowd around him saying, yes, out with the atheist. So again, the judge insists, promising that if he didn't swear by the emperor and curse Christ, he was going to be killed. But Polycarp replied this, for 86 years I have served Christ, and he has done me no evil. How could I curse my king, Jesus, who saved me? So now the dialogue's going on between these Christians and the judges, and now the judge threatens to have him burned alive. What does Polycarp say? He says the fire that the judge could light will last only a minute, whereas the eternal fire that he would face is never going to go out. So finally, we're told that after he was tied, Polycarp, to the pyre, he looked up, prayed out, Lord, sovereign God, I thank you that you have deemed me worthy for this moment to join your other martyrs, that I may have a share in the cup of Christ. And for this, I bless and glorify you. Man, what a great prayer, right? So, earlier in his career, Ignatius of Antioch had advised this Bishop Polycarp, telling him what his duties were as a bishop, and he needs to be firm in the faith. So obviously Polycarp is showing himself as a worthy hearer of Ignatius' advice and a follower of his example. Now there's a very significant note in this entire account of Polycarp. It is said that Polycarp fled and hid when he learned he was being sought by the Romans. We're told in the same account that a man named Quintus offered himself as a martyr, but he weakened at the last moment and he abandoned his faith. So this was important for these early Christians who believed martyrdom was not something that one chose. It was something for which God chose them. Those who were chosen were strengthened by Christ, who suffered with them. And for that reason, they were able to stand firm. So their firmness was not in their own doing, but God gave them the power to face martyrdom. Now, on the other hand, those who relented and ran from martyrdom were false martyrs. And then, because of that, back in those days, the belief was that Christ would desert them. But not all Christians agreed with the author of the Martyr of Polycarp, or the martyrdom of Polycarp. Throughout the entire period of Christian persecution there. Occasionally, there were spontaneous martyrs, and when they remained firm to the end, they found the approval of lots of people. And there's another document that it was written called the Apology of Justin Martyr. And we're told here that at a Christian's trial, 2 others came forth in his defense, and all 3 died as martyrs. And in telling the story of Justin Martyr, he doesn't give the slightest indication that the martyrdom of 2 spontaneous was less valid than that of the person who was originally accused. So all of this persecution was now happening under an emperor named Marcus Aurelius. You've heard that name, right? He was emperor in Rome in 161 AD, and this guy was a very enlightened man. He was not like Nero or Domitian, enamored with power and vainglory. On the contrary, he was a very refined and elegant guy who left behind a collection of meditations written for his private use and one of the literary masterpieces of the time. And in that meditation, he expresses some of the ideas with which he tried to rule his vast empire. Here's an excerpt. Think constantly, both as a Roman and as a man, to do the task before you with perfect and simple dignity, and with kindness, freedom, and justice. Man, those are new. Try to forget everything else, and you will be able to do so if you undertake every action in your life as if it were your last. Man, wisdom. Leaving aside all negligence and the opposition of passion to the dictates of reason, and leaving aside also all hypocrisy, all egotism, and rebelliousness against your own lot. So, under a guy like this now, it could be expected, I think, that Christians would enjoy a period of relative peace, right? And yet, he's the same emperor who expressed these lofty ideas of government, also ordered that Christians be persecuted. And there is a reference to Christianity in his meditations. He praises those souls that are ready to abandon their bodies when the time comes, rather than cling to life. He goes on to say that this attitude is praiseworthy only when it's the outcome of reason and not obstinacy. And that was the case with the Christians. They weren't being obstinate. They had reasoned it out that martyrdom was the way to go if they had to choose. Furthermore, as a child of the age, this enlightened emperor was also extremely superstitious. He constantly sought the advice of seers, and before every significant undertaking, sacrifices had to be offered. Now, during the early years of the reign of his reign, there was an endless string of invasions, floods, epidemics, and other diseases. And lots of people, blamed the Christians for this, that they had brought the wrath of God, the gods, small g, upon the empire. But it was impossible to know for sure that the emperor believed that explanation. In any case, he gave full support to the persecution of the Christians. And he actually favored the revival of some old religions, like Pliny, when he found Christians objectionable because of their stubbornness. One of the most informative documents from this time is the one that tells of the martyrdom of a lady named Felicitas and her 7 sons. She was a consecrated widow, that is, a woman who devoted all her time to the church, and the church in turn supported her. Now, her work was such that pagan priests decided to put an end to it by accusing her before the authorities. And when the prefect tried to persuade her, first with promises, then with threats, to abandon her faith, she answered that they were wasting their time. She says, "While I live, I shall defeat you. And if you kill me in my death, I shall defeat you all the more." The prefect then tried to persuade her sons to come to their senses, but she encouraged her sons to stand firm. And they did. And finally, the record of the inquest was sent to Marcus Aurelius, who ordered that they should die in different sections of the city to appease the various Roman gods. Really crazy stuff. Now, there was another martyr during the persecution of Justin Martyr, perhaps the best Christian scholar of the time. He founded a school in Rome where he taught what he called the true philosophy. What was the true philosophy? Christianity. And he'd recently bested a famous pagan philosopher in a public debate. Kind of like, who's that famous, Kent Hovind. Kent Hovind, if you ever heard of him, have not heard of him before, go to YouTube, and this guy debates all of these scholastic college professors. He must have done hundreds of them. Kent, K-E-N-T, Hovind, H-O-V-I-N-D. Very, very interesting fellow. So anyway, this famous Christian has debated a lot of these pagan philosophers, and there's indications that this philosopher accused him of transgressions against the state. But in any case, Justin Martyr died as a martyr in Rome, and in the acts of his martyrdom, the details are really questionable. But further insight into this persecution comes to us in a letter that the churches of Lyons and Vienna in Gaul sent to their fellow Christians in Phrygia and Asia Minor. And it seemed that at first this was all done in those cities to forbid Christians to visit public places. But when the mob began following Christians on the street, shouting at them, pelting them with bricks and rocks, finally arresting many of them, they were taken before the governor to be tried. Now there's a guy named Vicius Epagathus, I think his name was. E-P-A-G-A-T-H-U-S, Epagathus. He came from among the mob and offered to defend the Christians. And when the mob asked if he was one of them, he said he was. And then he was added to the group of the accused. So the writers of this letter explained that persecution had appeared unexpectedly like a bolt of lightning, and that it was the reason why many were not prepared. Some of them weakened. The rest, however, stood firm, and this increased the wrath of the governor and the mob. So torture was ordered. Now in comes a guy named Sanctus, and he simply says, I am a Christian. And the more he was tortured, the more he persisted in saying, I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian. And, the others were moved by his signs of courage, and some who earlier denied the faith returned to confess, and they died as martyrs. There's a mosaic of this martyrdom of the 40 martyrs, and they were let out in the cold to be frozen to death. Now, it doesn't really tell you how many of them died, but the letter does say that the place where Christians were being held was so full of prisoners that some died of suffocation, not unlike what happened in the Nazi concentration camps. So these are a few of the things that took place during the period of so-called enlightenment of Marcus Aurelius. And there are other accounts of martyrdom back in those days. But you have to suppose that the accounts that survive tell of what was taking place not only in Rome, but all throughout the Roman Empire. So this guy, Marcus Aurelius, he dies in A.D. 180, and he was succeeded by a guy named Commodus. Everybody heard of him? He began to rule with Marcus Aurelius 8 years earlier, and although Commodus didn't issue any edicts against persecution, the persecutions kind of abated during his reign. The number of martyrs was relatively low. And when he died, there was a period of civil war, and Christians were once again ignored in favor of more pressing matters, the civil war happening. And then finally, in A.D. 193, a guy named Septimius Severus became the ruler of the empire. And under him, Christians were able to live in peace and tranquility. But eventually, he too added his name to the growing list of rulers who persecuted Christians. And since this was the early part of the 3rd century, there's another point that happens in the narrative. So in summary, during that entire 2nd century, Christians were, in one way or another, persecuted in the Roman Empire. And it was constant. Sometimes they were persecuted in Rome, sometimes in other areas. And since the general policy of the empire from Trajan on, Christians were not to be sought, but if they were brought before the authorities, they had to either recant their Christianity or they were punished and killed. So I think that's going to do it for today's teaching. I want to get into the next generation where we hear about people like Justin Martyr and many of the other new Christians, and how the sect now begins to turn from true Christianity to something that's really been bastardized. Anyway, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Hope you have a great day. God bless. Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. If you like what you hear, and you think your friends and relatives would benefit by the teaching, please share it with everyone you know. Thanks, and have a great day.